Hey friends, it's me, Miss Terrell, coming live from OA 13. This is the second part of the second unit, notes and lectures that you need. We're going to be focusing on mercantilism and the empire. Yeehaw. So the definition of mercantilism, it is essentially trade from the colonies and accumulation of wealth as the basis for a country's military and political strength. A government, under the idea of mercantilism, a government should regulate trade and production to enable it to become self-sufficient. Colonies, ideally, colonies were to provide raw materials to the parent countries for growth and profit of that country's industries. And colonies really only existed for one purpose under mercantilism, which was to enrich the parent country. So essentially, in the case of European colonies, head over to Europe, uh, figure out what raw materials are available, and harvest them, grow them, do whatever it is you have to do, and then you're going to send them back to the motherland, England in most cases, and England is going to profit off of those. Seems legit. Mercantilism policies guided both the Spanish and French colonies from the very beginning. Mercantilism began to be applied to English colonies. Whoops. Only after the turmoil of England's Civil War was over and done with, and then they could focus on what was happening overseas. Because of mercantilism, there needed to be some rules and regulations set up on how this was going to be governed. So England jumps into the mercantilism game and passes a series of navigation acts between 1650 and 1673. Basically, the regulations stipulated, number one, trade to and from the colonies could be carried only by English or colonial built ships, which could be operated only by English or colonial crews. Number two, all goods imported to the colonies, except for some perishables, had to pass through the ports of England. And number three, specific or enumerated goods from the colonies could be exported to England only. Tobacco was the original enumerated good, but over the years, the list greatly expanded. So I think you can see with these three regulations that England is going to be really in the forefront of profiting off of this concept of mercantilism. The impact that these trade and navigation laws have on the colonies, frankly, pretty much mixed effects. The acts caused New England shipbuilding to prosper, okay, because only the ships could only be English or colonial. So it also provided the Chesapeake Tobacco with a monopoly in England and provided English military forces to protect the colonies from potential attacks by the French and Spanish, which the colonists were always a little bit nervous of. However, the downside, these acts also severely limited the development of colonial manufacturing. If everything had to go through England and all raw materials were being shipped out, they weren't doing too much in the colonies themselves. It forced some farmers to accept the low prices, again, because of that monopoly situation, and it caused colonists to pay high prices for manufactured goods from England. So essentially, they're harvesting the raw materials, sending them to England. England's making the final products and then sending them back. So the colonists are going to have to pay high exorbitant prices when really they could be making those final products at home, but because of these regulations, they have to send out and then wait for it to come back. It's kind of foolish, but it is what it is. Now, how are these acts enforced? The British government was often not as strict as they should have been when it came to enforcing the acts, and we're going to see this again, where in the English authorities were a little bit lax leading up to the American Revolution. Also, the agents that were supposed to be doing said enforcing were typically corrupt, so not necessarily 100% trustworthy and maybe taking a little bit more of the profit than they should have been, so on and so forth. So the colonists weren't 100% trustworthy of these people. And every once in a while, however, the crown would make a point and do some heavy enforcing and try to get everybody back in line. I'm going to briefly talk about the Dominion of New England. There was a new king um, sent to the throne, James II. He comes in 1685 in England, and he's determined to increase the royal control over the colonies. He thinks that the previous crown had more of a hands-off approach, and that it would benefit the crown if it was more strict regulations. So essentially, he wanted to do away with the representative governments that some of the colonies had set up, which you've learned about in your previous lectures, and he wanted to make them into large administrative units. And one of the ways that he did this was he combined New York, New Jersey, and other New England colonies and created what was known as the Dominion of New England. He appointed one governor to see over this large dominion, and that lucky gentleman was Sir Edmund Andros. Andros made himself instantly unpopular by levying taxes, limiting town meetings, and revoking land titles. Obviously, this guy was not popular, but he was doing the things that the king wanted him to do. Meanwhile, back in England, when the Glorious Revolution happens, King James II is booted in 1688 and replaced with William and Mary. And as a result, the Old Dominion comes to an end, and that Dominion turns back into those original colonies, New England colonies. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at the institution of slavery. This is just a super brief overview. We'll talk about it more in class, and I'll have some pictures and diagrams and such for you. More important than mercantilism in the early 18th century is the growth of slavery. By 1750, half of Virginia's population were enslaved people. Why the demand for slavery, or why the demand for these kind of laborers? One, reduce migration. Increase wages in England, reduce the supply of immigrants to the colonies. Things were going pretty good in England at the time. People had good paying jobs. They didn't want to leave and come here and start fresh. So numbers of indentured servants and people willing to work were severely reduced. Two, dependable workforce. Slaves were totally under the control of their slave owners. They didn't have any say in what they got to do or what they didn't have to do. So essentially, the slave owner said, you need to do this. They had to do it. With an indentured servant or a laborer that you're paying, you might run into issues where they're sick, they don't come to work, they're particularly lazy, they're not doing what you ask them to do, and there's no real consequence. Slaves don't have that luxury, actually. Number three, cheap labor. You need a lot of people to work your plantations. As tobacco prices began to fall, new cash crops began to come into play. Those in particular were rice and indigo. And you need a lot of space and you need a lot of people in order to help with your rice and indigo harvest. So you needed to be able to afford that labor, and slavery was a good choice for that. Slave laws started to be enacted around the original 13 colonies. Slave laws were laws that were adopted to assure that African Americans would be held in bondage for life and that slave status would be inherited. If your mother was a slave, essentially it was carried down through her heritage. So if you were the child of a slave woman, you therefore would also be a slave. Massachusetts became the first colony to recognize the enslavement of lawful captives. In 1661, Virginia, children automatically inherited their mother's enslaved status for life. In Maryland, 1664, baptism did not affect the enslaved person status. Even if you were baptized into a Christian faith, you still were going to be a slave, no way around it. And of course, it became a law that white women could not marry African American men. Racism and slavery soon became an integral part of colonial society. And again, we'll explore more of this in class. With the institution of slavery comes something pretty unique to the 13 colonies in the triangular trade route. Triangular trade is just that, a three-part trade route. Shipping, a ship would leave New England, it would carry rum, that should say rum, sorry. It would carry rum across the Atlantic to West Africa, and rum would be traded for hundreds of captive Africans. In class, we'll talk more about how those Africans came to be captured and what the situation was in West Africa. The ship would set out, the second route is that the ship would set out on the terrible Middle Passage. We'll talk more about the Middle Passage again when I see you in class. Those that survived it would be traded in the West Indies for sugarcane. So here we have this peculiar situation where we're trading actual live human beings for raw materials to be used later. Just pretty disgraceful in my feelings. And then number 3, the ship would return to New England where the sugarcane would then be used to make rum. Okay, so that's what we have for today's lecture notes. When I see you in class next, we will get more into depth about the triangular trade, the peculiar institution of slavery, and the Middle Passage. Hope you all have a great day. See you later.